The silence in courtroom 3B was deafening, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your heart pound against your ribs. Judge Catherine Morrison had seen everything in her 32 years on the bench: hardened criminals breaking down, victims finding their voice, attorneys crumbling under pressure. But she had never seen anything like this. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera stood at attention before the witness stand, his weathered hand trembling as it moved toward his forehead, in what would be his final salute to the German shepherd lying motionless on the polished marble floor. The dog's name was Thor, a magnificent beast whose dark sable coat still gleamed despite the years, whose intelligent amber eyes had seen more combat than most soldiers twice his age. Now those eyes were closed, his massive chest rising and falling in labored breaths that echoed through the courtroom like a countdown timer. "Your Honor," Marcus's voice cracked, barely above a whisper, "I request permission to say goodbye." The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Lawson, shifted uncomfortably in her designer suit. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how military court proceedings were supposed to go. But then again, nothing about this case had gone according to plan since the moment Thor had collapsed during opening statements 3 hours ago. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency veterinarian who had been rushed to the courthouse, knelt beside the dying K9 with tears streaming down her face. "He's holding on," she whispered to no one in particular. "I don't know how, but he's holding on." Marcus dropped to one knee beside his partner of 8 years, his dress uniform, adorned with medals from 2 tours in Afghanistan, suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His hand found the familiar spot behind Thor's left ear, the place where a piece of shrapnel had left a scar during the Kandahar incident that had changed both their lives forever. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, his voice breaking entirely now. "You did good. You did so damn good." But as his fingers traced that old scar, something impossible happened. Thor's eyes snapped open, not the cloudy, distant gaze of a dying animal, but sharp, focused, burning with an intensity that made several people in the gallery gasp audibly. The dog's head turned, not toward Marcus, not toward the judge or the lawyers, but toward the back corner of the courtroom, where a man in an expensive navy suit sat perfectly still, his face drained of all color. Colonel James Whitfield, the defendant, in this court-martial, pressed himself back into his chair as if trying to disappear into the mahogany paneling. For the past 3 days he had maintained his innocence with the confidence of a man who believed his rank and reputation would shield him from the accusations of embezzlement, dereliction of duty, and worse. But now, under Thor's unwavering stare, something cracked in his composure. "Get that dog away from me," Whitfield whispered, then louder. "Get that damn dog away from me." Thor struggled to his feet, an effort that should have been impossible given his condition, and let out a sound that no one present would ever forget. It wasn't a bark or a growl or a whimper. It was something primal, ancient, a vocalization. That seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat, deeper than his chest, deeper than his very soul. It was the sound of accusation, of truth demanding to be heard, of justice refusing to be silenced. The bailiff, a 20-year veteran, named Rodriguez, found himself frozen in place, his hand halfway to his radio. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. Judge Morrison gripped her gavel but couldn't bring herself to strike it. In all her years presiding over military courts, she had learned to read people, to sense when testimony was truthful or fabricated, when a defendant was innocent or guilty. But this was something beyond her experience, beyond her training, beyond anything she thought possible. Thor took one unsteady step toward Colonel Whitfield, then another. With each labored movement, the silence in the courtroom grew heavier, more oppressive. The dog's breathing was audible now to everyone present, a rasping sound that seemed to sync with the collective heartbeat of 53 witnesses. "Your Honor," defense attorney Michael Garrett stammered, his usual composure shattered. I don't know what's happening here, but this is highly irregular." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Morrison commanded, without taking her eyes off the unfolding scene. Marcus rose from his knees, his soldier's instincts warring with his emotional devastation. He had trained Thor, fought beside him, saved lives with him, nearly died with him. He knew every one of the dog's behaviors, every subtle signal, every expression. But this This was something he had never seen before. Thor stopped 3 feet from Colonel Whitfield's chair and sat, his posture perfect despite his condition, his gaze never wavering from the man's face. It was the same position he had taken countless times in the field, when he had detected explosives, when he had found the enemy, when he had discovered something that needed to be found. But Colonel Whitfield wasn't hiding explosives or enemy combatants. Or was he hiding something else entirely? The colonel's breathing became rapid, shallow. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the courtroom's controlled temperature. His hands, which had remained steady throughout 3 days of damning testimony, began to shake. "I said, get that dog away from me!" Whitfield shouted, his voice cracking like ice under pressure. "He's dying! He doesn't know what he's doing!" But Thor did know. Thor had always known. And as he lifted his massive head and released one more of those otherworldly vocalizations, softer this time, more mournful, like a goodbye that carried the weight of years, every person in that courtroom understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The dog's body began to tremble with the effort of remaining upright, but his gaze never faltered. It was as if he was using the last of his strength, the final reserves of his life force, to deliver one last message, one final act of service to the truth he had spent his entire life protecting. And then, as the courtroom held its collective breath, Thor did something that would be talked about in legal circles for decades to come, something that would change the course of the trial, the lives of everyone present, and the very definition of what it meant to serve justice. He began to move again, not toward Colonel Whitfield this time, but toward something else entirely. Something that had been hiding in plain sight for 3 long days, waiting for the only witness who could reveal its true significance. 7 years earlier, Forward Operating Base, Shank, Afghanistan. The morning sun painted the Hindu Kush Mountains in shades of gold and amber as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera knelt in the dust beside a transport crate, his hands steady despite the chaos of the Forward Operating Base around him. Inside the crate, a 2-year-old German shepherd named Thor pressed against the metal mesh, his intelligent eyes taking in every detail of his new environment, the constant helicopter noise, the scent of diesel fuel and desert sand, the underlying tension that permeated every military installation in a combat zone. "Easy there, partner," Marcus murmured, unlatching the crate door. "Welcome to paradise." This was Marcus's second deployment, but his first time working with a K-9 unit. The 26-year-old from El Paso had volunteered for the military working dog program after watching his previous unit lose 3 soldiers to IEDs in a single week. If having a 4-legged partner could prevent even one family from receiving a folded flag, he was willing to learn everything there was to know about explosive detection. Thor emerged from the crate with the controlled confidence of a professional, his nose immediately going to work, cataloging the 1,000 different scents that made up Fob Shank. But when those amber eyes met Marcus's brown ones, something clicked, an instantaneous bond that would be tested by fire and forged into something unbreakable. "Sergeant Rivera?" Colonel James Whitfield approached, his crisp uniform somehow managing to look fresh despite the 110-degree heat. "I'm your CO. I trust you and your asset are ready for deployment." Even then, something about Whitfield rubbed Marcus the wrong way. Maybe it was how he called Thor an asset instead of a partner, or maybe it was the way his eyes never quite met Marcus's when he spoke. But Marcus was a soldier first, and he snapped to attention. "Yes, sir. Thor and I are ready to serve." "Good. You'll be accompanying Lieutenant Morrison's patrol tomorrow. Intel suggests IED activity along Route Copper. Your job is to keep our people alive." That first patrol changed everything. Marcus and Thor moved like they had been partners for years instead of days, the dog's nose leading them safely around 3 separate explosive devices that would have turned the Humvee patrol into scrap metal and body bags. By the time they returned to base, word had spread through the entire FOB. The new dog team was something special. Over the following months, Marcus and Thor became legendary within their unit. They cleared over 200 miles of roadway, found dozens of explosive devices, and saved countless lives. But it was during the incident that would later be known as the Kandahar miracle, that their bond transcended partnership and became something deeper, something that would echo through the years and ultimately lead them to that fateful courtroom. 6 years earlier, outside Kandahar city, the convoy was supposed to be routine: escort a supply truck to a forward checkpoint, return to base before sunset. But in Afghanistan, routine was a luxury that existed only in planning rooms and situation briefings. Marcus and Thor rode in the lead vehicle, the dog's head out the window, nose working constantly. They had been on the road for 20 minutes when Thor suddenly went rigid, his body language screaming danger in a way that needed no translation. "Stop!" Marcus shouted to the driver. "Thor's got something." The convoy ground to a halt on the dusty road, engines idling, everyone's nerves stretched tight. Marcus deployed with Thor, letting the dog work his magic. Within minutes, Thor had located not one but 3 IEDs buried in the roadway ahead, a kill zone that would have destroyed the entire convoy. But as the EOD team moved in to clear the devices, Thor's behavior changed again. Instead of the satisfied calm that usually followed a successful find, the dog became agitated, pulling toward a compound of mud brick buildings about 200 meters off the road. "What's he got now?" asked Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the patrol leader who would later become Judge Morrison. Marcus trusted his partner completely. "He's telling us something. Thor doesn't get worked up over nothing." They approached the compound cautiously, Thor leading the way. The buildings appeared abandoned, but as they got closer, Thor's agitation increased. He began to whine, not from fear but from frustration, as if he was trying to communicate something crucial that his human partners couldn't understand. That's when they heard it, a child's cry, faint but unmistakable, coming from beneath one of the collapsed buildings. "Jesus," whispered Corporal Jenkins, the youngest member of the patrol, "there's someone under there." What followed was a frantic 2-hour rescue operation. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, had been trapped beneath the rubble when part of the building collapsed during a firefight 3 days earlier. Her family thought she was dead. The local authorities had given up searching, but Thor had detected her scent from 2 football fields away and refused to let it go. They pulled Amara, that was her name, from the rubble, dehydrated and injured, but alive. As the medics worked on her, she reached out a tiny hand toward Thor, babbling something in Pashto. The interpreter, a grizzled Afghan named Hassan, wiped tears from his eyes as he translated. "She says the dog is an angel. She says she prayed to Allah for help, and Allah sent her a guardian angel with fur and kind eyes. But the miracle came with a price." As they loaded Amara into the medevac helicopter, a sniper opened fire from a nearby ridge. The shots were wild, panicked, but one fragment of concrete shattered by a bullet caught Thor in the head, just behind his left ear. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it left a permanent scar and something else. From that day forward, Thor seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense not just explosives and enemies, but human deception, fear, and guilt. Marcus noticed it first during their next patrol. They encountered a group of Afghan national police at a checkpoint, and Thor immediately became agitated around one particular officer, a man who, it later turned out, had been feeding information to the Taliban. The dog's behavior had saved them from walking into an ambush. Word of Thor's abilities spread, and soon other units were requesting their assistance, not just for explosive detection, but for what soldiers began calling truth-sniffing. Thor could detect lies, betrayal, and hidden guilt with the same accuracy he brought to finding buried bombs. Colonel Whitfield took notice, and his requests for Marcus and Thor's services became more frequent. But Marcus began to observe that Thor's behavior around the colonel was different. Not aggressive exactly, but wary. The dog never fully relaxed in Whitfield's presence, never accepted treats from his hand, never responded to his attempts at friendliness. "Your dog doesn't like me much," Whitfield commented one day after a briefing. "Thor's a good judge of character, sir," Marcus replied, then immediately regretted the implication, but Whitfield just laughed it off. "I'm sure he is, Sergeant. I'm sure he is." Present day. Courthouse steps. 1 hour before the trial, Marcus sat on the courthouse steps, Thor lying beside him, both of them watching the morning sun paint the city in shades of hope and regret. The years had been kind to neither of them. Marcus carried the invisible wounds of 2 tours in Afghanistan and the visible scar on his left shoulder, where an insurgent's bullet had found its mark during their final patrol. Thor, now 9 years old, moved more slowly than he used to, his muzzle showing grey, his breathing sometimes laboured. They had been civilian for 3 years now, Marcus working as a security consultant, while Thor served as a therapy dog at the local VA hospital. The work was meaningful, helping other veterans cope with the demons that followed them home from war, but nothing could match the intensity of their partnership in the field until today, until Colonel Whitfield's court-martial brought them back into a world they thought they had left behind. "You ready for this, boy?" Marcus asked, his fingers finding that familiar scar behind Thor's ear. The dog looked up at him with those amber eyes that had seen too much, survived too much, saved too many lives to count. And Marcus could swear he saw understanding there. Not just the simple understanding of a well-trained animal, but something deeper. Something that suggested Thor knew exactly why they were here, exactly what role he was meant to play in the drama about to unfold. As they climbed the courthouse steps, together, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be just another day of testimony and legal maneuvering. Something was coming. Something that would test the bond between him and Thor one last time. Something that would demand every ounce of courage, loyalty, and truth they had ever shared. He just didn't know it would also demand Thor's life. The morning session of Colonel Whitfield's court-martial had been proceeding according to plan, until Thor collapsed. It happened during Prosecutor Victoria Lawson's opening statement, as she outlined the charges against the decorated officer. Embezzlement of funds meant for Afghan reconstruction projects, dereliction of duty that resulted in soldiers being denied proper equipment, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Serious charges that could end Whitfield's career and send him to military prison for 20 years. Marcus had been sitting in the gallery with Thor at his feet, both of them there at the prosecution's request. Marcus was scheduled to testify about discrepancies he had observed in supply deliveries during his deployment, testimony that could corroborate the financial irregularities the prosecution was trying to prove. Thor had been unusually restless all morning. From the moment they entered the courthouse, the dog had been alert, his nose working constantly, his body language suggesting he was tracking something important. Marcus attributed it to the stress of being in an unfamiliar environment, surrounded by strangers in formal attire. But as Prosecutor Lawson described how Colonel Whitfield had allegedly diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars from accounts meant to fund Afghan schools and medical clinics, Thor suddenly went rigid. His breathing became labored, his eyes fixed on something in the front of the courtroom with laser intensity. "The evidence will show," Lawson continued, "that Colonel Whitfield used his position of trust to enrich himself, while Afghan children went without textbooks, while medical supplies were delayed or never arrived, while our own soldiers—" That's when Thor made a sound unlike anything Marcus had ever heard from him, a low, mournful keen that seemed to come from his very soul. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the German shepherd, as he struggled to his feet, swayed for a moment, then collapsed to the floor. "Thor!" Marcus dropped from his seat, his hands immediately going to his partner's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Judge Morrison called for a recess while Dr. Chen was summoned, but as the veterinarian worked over Thor, something strange began to happen. The dog's condition seemed to stabilize whenever his gaze fell on Colonel Whitfield, and worsen when the colonel left his line of sight. "This is highly irregular," defense attorney Garrett protested to Judge Morrison during the break. "My client is being subjected to some kind of, I don't know what to call it, psychological intimidation by a dying animal?" But Bailiff Rodriguez, who had worked in the courthouse for 2 decades, saw something else entirely. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I've seen a lot of strange things in my time, but I've never seen an animal react to a specific person the way that dog is reacting to the colonel." Court reporter Janet Mills, whose job required her to observe and record everything that happened in the courtroom, was equally disturbed. "The dog's vitals seem to spike every time Colonel Whitfield speaks or moves," she whispered to her colleague. It's like he's responding to something the rest of us can't detect. When court reconvened, Dr. Chen had managed to stabilize Thor enough to continue, but she remained kneeling beside him, monitoring his condition. "I have to advise that this animal is in critical condition," she announced. "He should be in an emergency veterinary hospital, not a courtroom." "The dog stays," Judge Morrison decided, after a brief consultation with both legal teams. "Mr. Rivera is a scheduled witness, and the animal appears to be calm as long as he remains with his handler." But calm was not the word anyone would use to describe Thor's behavior over the next 2 hours. As witness after witness took the stand, soldiers who had served under Whitfield, Afghan nationals who had been promised aid that never arrived, accountants who had traced the missing funds, Thor's responses became increasingly agitated. Sergeant First Class Williams, a supply specialist, testified about equipment requisitions that had been approved but never filled. As he spoke, Thor's breathing became more labored. Captain Rodriguez described Afghan orphanages that had been promised medical supplies, only to receive empty crates or expired medications. Thor whined softly, a sound of distress that carried clearly through the courtroom's audio system. But it was during the testimony of Afghan interpreter Hassan, the same man who had translated little Amara's words about Thor being an angel, that something truly unsettling occurred. Hassan, now living in the United States under a special visa program, took the stand to describe how promised reconstruction funds had never materialized, how schools had remained without books, how medical clinics had operated without basic supplies. His English was excellent, his testimony damning, his sincerity evident to everyone present, except apparently to Thor. As Hassan spoke about specific instances where Colonel Whitfield had personally assured him that supplies were en route, Thor became increasingly agitated, not in the accusatory way he had been reacting to Whitfield, but in a different way, a confused, conflicted way that Marcus had never seen before. "Something's wrong," Marcus whispered to the prosecutor during a brief sidebar conference. "Thor's reading something in Hassan's testimony that doesn't match what he's saying." Victoria Lawson looked skeptical. "Sergeant Rivera, with all due respect to your partnership with your dog, we can't base a prosecution on animal behavior." But Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring Thor's vital signs throughout the testimony, had to disagree. "Actually, you might want to listen to Sergeant Rivera. This dog's physiological responses are unlike anything I've seen in 30 years of veterinary practice. It's as if he's responding to stress pheromones, micro-expressions, vocal stress patterns, things that would be imperceptible to humans but completely obvious to a highly trained detection animal." Judge Morrison called another recess, during which several troubling conversations took place. Court Security Officer Martinez approached Bailiff Rodriguez with a concern. "I've been watching the gallery during testimony. Every time that dog gets agitated, I see the same 3 people in the back rows checking their phones, texting, whispering to each other. It might be nothing, but you don't believe in coincidences any more than I do," Rodriguez finished. Meanwhile, in the prosecution's conference room, Victoria Lawson was having second thoughts about Hassan's testimony. "His story is consistent with everything else we've heard, but there's something about his responses to specific questions. He gets defensive when we ask about timeline details, almost like he's hiding something." "Hassan's a good man," Marcus protested. "He risked his life helping American forces. He saved my life, Thor's life, probably dozens of others." "I'm not questioning his character," Lawson replied. "I'm questioning whether he's telling us everything he knows." But the most disturbing conversation was taking place in the defense team's conference room, where Colonel Whitfield was displaying cracks in his previously unshakable composure. "That damned dog knows something," he hissed to his attorney. "I'm telling you, Michael, there's something unnatural about the way it's looking at me." "James, you're being paranoid. It's a dying animal. Whatever it's responding to, it's not some kind of supernatural truth detection." Then explain why it collapsed the moment the prosecutor started talking about the Afghan reconstruction funds. Explain why it gets agitated every time someone mentions specific dates and locations. Explain why it keeps staring at Hassan like it's trying to solve a puzzle. Defense attorney Garrett had no explanations. He had built his career on logic, evidence and legal precedent. He didn't believe in psychic dogs or animals that could detect lies, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing with his own eyes. When court reconvened for the afternoon session, the atmosphere had changed palpably. What had begun as a straightforward court-martial was evolving into something far more complex and unsettling. Thor lay on his side now, his breathing shallow but steady, his eyes moving between Colonel Whitfield and Hassan with an intensity that made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable. "Your Honor," Defense Attorney Garrett rose to address the court. "I move for a mistrial based on prejudicial influence. This animal's behavior is clearly affecting the proceedings in ways that are impossible to quantify or control." But before Judge Morrison could respond, Thor did something that made the motion irrelevant. The dog struggled to his feet one more time, his legs shaking with the effort, and walked directly to the witness stand where Hassan sat. He stopped at the base of the stand and performed the same sit that he had done earlier with Colonel Whitfield. The perfect, alert posture of a detection dog who had found what he was looking for. Hassan's face went pale. His hands began to shake. And when Thor lifted his head and released another of those otherworldly vocalizations, the interpreter broke down entirely. "I'm sorry," Hassan sobbed in accented English. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to lie, but they said they would. Hurt my family if I didn't." The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison gavelled for order as both legal teams scrambled to understand what was happening. But Marcus, kneeling beside his dying partner, understood perfectly. Thor hadn't been detecting lies in Hassan's testimony. He had been detecting fear, coercion, the psychological signature of a man being forced to say things that weren't entirely true. The question now was, who had been forcing Hassan to lie, and what truth had they been trying to hide? As if in answer to that unspoken question, Thor turned his amber gaze one final time toward Colonel Whitfield, and the look that passed between them carried the weight of years, the burden of secrets, and the unrelenting demand for justice that had defined the dog's entire life. The truth was coming, and Colonel Whitfield knew it. 5 years earlier, Forward Operating Base Shank, Afghanistan. The folder landed on Marcus's bunk with a soft thud, its contents spilling slightly onto his sleeping bag. Colonel Whitfield stood in the entrance to the tent, his expression unreadable in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "I need you and Thor to check something for me, Sergeant," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of command, but also something else, something that made Thor's ears perk up from where he lay beside Marcus's cot. Marcus sat up, gathering the scattered papers. Supply manifests, transport schedules, inventory reports, all routine paperwork for a forward operating base, except for one detail that made his blood run cold. "Sir, these are all for supplies that were never delivered to the Afghan national. Police checkpoints, the medical supplies, the school materials, the—" Marcus trailed off as he noticed Thor's behavior. The dog had gone completely still, his nose working overtime, his attention fixed on the papers with an intensity usually reserved for explosive devices. "That's why I need your dog to check the supply depot," Whitfield explained. "Intel suggests someone might be hiding something in there. Maybe explosives, maybe stolen goods. Thor's the best detection asset we have." But as they walked across the compound toward the supply depot, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Thor was alert, professional, but there was something in his body language that suggested he was tracking multiple scents, multiple concerns, multiple layers of deception. The supply depot was a converted shipping container, one of dozens that dotted the fob like metal monuments to military logistics. But when Thor began his search, his behavior was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Instead of the systematic grid pattern he usually employed, the dog kept returning to specific areas that corresponded exactly with the manifests Whitfield had shown them. "He's got something," Marcus reported as Thor went into his alert position near a stack of medical supply crates. But when they opened the crates, they found exactly what the manifests said they should find: bandages, antibiotics, surgical supplies, all properly packed and labeled for delivery to Afghan medical facilities. "False alarm," Whitfield said, but Marcus noticed the relief in his voice. Must have been a false lead from Intel. As they prepared to leave, Thor did something unprecedented. He walked back to the crates, sat in his alert position again, then looked directly at Marcus with an expression that seemed to say, "Look deeper, look closer. Something is wrong here." "Thor's still alerting, sir," Marcus reported. Whitfield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes dogs get confused by residual scent, Sergeant. Explosives, chemicals, cleaning supplies, it all gets mixed up." But Marcus trusted his partner completely. He approached the crates again, this time examining not just the contents, but the containers themselves. That's when he noticed it. The serial numbers on the medical supplies didn't match the batch numbers on the manifests. Someone had replaced the original supplies with different ones. "Sir, I think we need to—" "That's enough, Sergeant." Whitfield's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "File your report as negative findings. Thor must be having an off day." As they walked back across the compound, Marcus felt Thor's tension through the leash. The dog kept looking back at the depot, then up at Marcus, then toward Colonel Whitfield, with an expression that Marcus was only now beginning to understand. Profound disappointment in humans who chose corruption over truth. Present day. Courthouse. Corridor during recess. "Hassan, what did you mean when you said they would hurt your family?" Victoria Lawson pressed the interpreter in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. "Who threatened you?" Hassan's hands shook as he accepted a cup of water from the bailiff. Through the glass wall, he could see Thor lying on the courtroom floor, Dr. Chen monitoring his condition, Marcus kneeling beside him. "The dog knows," Hassan whispered. "I don't understand how, but he knows." "Knows what?" "That I was not completely truthful about all the details. But please, you must understand. I never lied about Colonel Whitfield taking the money. That part is true, but some of the other things, the specific dates, the exact amounts—" Hassan's voice broke. "They made me change some details to protect other people. Hassan, I need you to be completely honest with me right now. Lives could be at stake." The interpreter looked through the glass again, his eyes finding Thor's still form. "3 months ago, men came to my house in Fairfax. Americans, but not soldiers. They knew things about my family back in Afghanistan, things they shouldn't have known. They said if I testified completely truthfully about everything I witnessed, my sister's children would disappear." Marcus appeared in the doorway, having left Thor in Dr. Chen's care. "Hassan, what are you talking about? What weren't you truthful about?" "Marcus, my friend, I'm so sorry. The reconstruction money that Colonel Whitfield stole, he was not working alone. There were others, Americans and Afghans both. But these others, they have power here in America, connections that reach back to Afghanistan." "Names," Lawson demanded. "I need names. I don't know all of them. But I know that Hassan al-Rashid, the Afghan contractor who was supposed to build the schools, he is not just a contractor. He is working with American officials to move money, to hide evidence, to make sure the truth never comes out completely." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Hassan al-Rashid was the same contractor whose work they had inspected during their patrols, the same man whose supply deliveries Thor had always been suspicious of, the same man who had been notably absent from the witness list despite being central to the entire operation. "Where is al-Rashid now?" Marcus asked. "That's what's so strange," Hassan replied. "The men who threatened me, they said he was here, in America, working with people who could make problems disappear. But they also said that if I testified about seeing him meeting with Colonel Whitfield and the others, if I mentioned the other Americans who were involved—" "What other Americans?" Lawson's voice was sharp with urgency. Hassan looked around. The small room as if expecting to see hidden microphones, surveillance devices, threats lurking in the shadows. "There was a man, an American civilian, who came to Fob Shank many times during the time you were there, Marcus. He wore expensive suits, flew in on private helicopters, met with Colonel Whitfield in closed-door sessions. Thor never liked him, remember? Your dog would get agitated whenever this man was around," Marcus remembered. There had been a series of visits from a State Department official, someone involved in Afghan reconstruction oversight. Thor had indeed been unusually wary around the man, but Marcus had attributed it to the stranger's nervous energy and unfamiliarity with military dogs. "What was his name?" Marcus asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. I heard Colonel Whitfield call him Mr. Patterson. Robert Patterson, I think. He was very interested in the supply chains, the delivery schedules, the inventory reports, always asking about which routes were secure, which checkpoints were reliable, which Afghan contractors could be trusted. Victoria Lawson went pale. Hassan, are you telling me that Robert Patterson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Robert Patterson, was involved in this conspiracy? I think so, yes. But the men who threatened me, they said if I mentioned his name, if I connected him to the missing supplies and stolen money, my family would pay the price. Through the glass wall, they could see commotion in the courtroom. Dr. Chen was calling. For medical equipment, Thor's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Judge Morrison was trying to maintain order as both legal teams argued about how to proceed. But Marcus wasn't paying attention to the chaos. His mind was racing through memories, connecting dots that should have been connected years ago. The supply depot inspection, the mysterious civilian visits, Thor's consistent suspicion of certain people, the supply manifests that never quite matched the delivered goods. Hassan, Marcus said slowly, when you saw Patterson meeting with Whitfield, were there others present, other Americans? Sometimes, yes, there was a woman, always very professional, always taking notes. And sometimes there was another military officer, someone with many medals, someone who seemed to have authority even over Colonel Whitfield. Can you describe him? Hassan closed his eyes, concentrating. Older than Whitfield, silver hair, a scar on his left hand. He spoke with a southern accent, and he was very interested in Thor, always asking about your dog's capabilities, about what he could detect, about how accurate his alerts were. Marcus felt the world tilt. The description matched someone he had met only briefly during his deployment, someone who had observed one of Thor's demonstrations, someone who had asked very specific questions about the dog's ability to detect, not just explosives, but also human deception. General Raymond Hayes, the officer who had signed off on Marcus and Thor's transfer back to the States. The officer who had personally recommended them for the K9 therapy program at the VA hospital. The officer who had been sending Christmas cards and checking on their well-being for the past 3 years. The officer who had suggested that Marcus attend Colonel Whitfield's court-martial as a witness. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered. They didn't want us here to testify against Whitfield. They wanted us here because Thor is the only witness who can identify all of them. They wanted to see if he still remembered, if he could still connect them to the crimes. But why would they take such a risk? Lawson asked. Marcus looked through the glass at his dying partner, at the loyal animal who had spent his entire career serving truth and justice, who was now using the last of his strength to expose one final conspiracy. Because they thought Thor was just a dog, Marcus said grimly. They didn't understand that he never forgets a scent, never forgets the chemical signature of fear and guilt and deception. They thought his detection abilities were limited to explosives and narcotics. And they were wrong? Marcus nodded, his eyes filling with tears as he watched Dr. Chen work frantically over Thor's still form. Thor doesn't just detect bombs and drugs. He detects lies, betrayal, corruption, anything that carries the scent of human evil 3 years earlier. Walter Reed, National Military Medical Center. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus sat in the sterile waiting room, Thor's head resting heavily on his lap. They had been coming to Walter Reed for months now, Thor serving as a therapy dog for wounded veterans, while Marcus attended his own counseling sessions. But today was different. Today, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Judge Morrison's daughter and the head of the hospital's veterinary psychology program, had requested a meeting that would change everything they thought they knew about Thor's capabilities. Sergeant Rivera, Dr. Morrison said as she entered the room with a thick file under her arm, "Thank you for coming in. I wanted to discuss some unusual patterns we've been observing in Thor's work with our patients." Marcus straightened in his chair, his hand automatically going to the familiar spot behind Thor's ear. "Is there a problem, Doc? Has Thor done something wrong?" Quite the opposite. Dr. Morrison settled into the chair across from them, opening her file to reveal pages of charts, behavioral analyses, and medical reports. Thor has been demonstrating abilities that go far beyond standard therapy dog training. He's been identifying patients with undiagnosed PTSD, detecting early signs of depression and anxiety, and in 3 separate cases, He's alerted us to veterans who were having suicidal thoughts before they had verbalized those thoughts to anyone. Marcus frowned. Thor's always been intuitive about people's emotional states. That's what made him such a good detection dog in Afghanistan. This goes beyond intuition, Sergeant. We've been monitoring Thor's interactions with patients for 6 months now, and the data is extraordinary. He's demonstrating what can only be described as an ability to detect neurochemical changes associated with trauma, deception, and psychological distress. Dr. Morrison pulled out a series of photographs showing Thor working with different patients. In each image, the dog's posture and positioning seemed to correspond with specific patient conditions that had only been formally diagnosed weeks later. For example, she continued, Master Sergeant Collins came in for routine physical therapy after an IED injury. Standard psychological screening showed no signs of PTSD or emotional trauma, but Thor refused to leave his side during the entire session, exhibiting the same alert behavior you've described from his explosive detection work. And 3 weeks later, Collins attempted suicide. He's alive because Thor's behavior prompted us to schedule additional psychological evaluations that revealed severe depression and PTSD that Collins had been hiding from medical staff and family members. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. You're saying Thor knew Collins was suicidal before Collins himself knew it. I'm saying Thor detected neurochemical markers, stress hormones, adrenaline spikes, changes in body chemistry that indicated severe psychological distress. The same way he could detect explosive residue or narcotic substances, he's detecting the chemical signatures of human deception and emotional trauma. Dr. Morrison leaned forward, her expression intense. Sergeant Rivera, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. During your deployment, did you ever notice Thor reacting to people who later turned out to be lying, betraying their duties, or hiding information? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Suddenly, years of memories came flooding back, memories he had dismissed as coincidence or attributed to Thor's general wariness around strangers. Colonel Whitfield, the supply depot inspections, the civilian contractor who had always made Thor nervous, the Afghan police officer who had turned out to be feeding information to the Taliban. Jesus, Marcus whispered. He's been doing this all along. I just didn't understand what I was seeing. There's more. Dr. Morrison pulled out another set of documents. I've been in contact with other canine handlers whose dogs have shown similar abilities. It's rare, but not unheard of. Dogs who develop these capabilities usually do so after experiencing significant trauma themselves. Trauma that heightens their natural detection abilities to supernatural levels. The Kandahar incident, Marcus said immediately. When Thor was injured during the rescue of that little girl, that's when his behavior started changing. That would fit the pattern. Traumatic brain injuries in highly intelligent animals can sometimes result in enhanced sensory processing, particularly in areas related to threat detection and social awareness. Dr. Morrison closed the file and looked directly at Marcus. Sergeant, Rivera, what I'm about to tell you is highly classified, and I need your word that it won't leave this room without proper authorization. Marcus nodded, though his heart was already pounding with anticipation. The Department of Defense has been quietly investigating reports of military working dogs with enhanced detection capabilities, dogs who can identify enemy combatants before they act, who can detect IEDs buried deeper than should be possible, who can sense ambushes and betrayals before they occur. How many dogs? 7 that we know of, including Thor. All of them were injured in combat. All of them developed their enhanced abilities after their injuries, and all of them have been targeted. The word targeted hit Marcus like ice water. What do you mean targeted? 3 of the dogs have died under suspicious circumstances. 2 have disappeared entirely. 1 was poisoned at a military base in Germany, and another was killed in what was officially ruled a training accident, but showed signs of deliberate sabotage. Marcus's hand tightened protectively on Thor's collar. Someone is killing these dogs? Someone is eliminating potential witnesses, Sergeant. Think about it. If these dogs can detect deception and betrayal with the same accuracy they bring to explosive detection, they represent a serious threat to anyone involved in military corruption, war profiteering, or treason. The implications. crashed over Marcus like an avalanche. Every inspection Thor had performed, every person he had alerted on, every instance where his behavior had seemed inexplicably suspicious, it all added up to a comprehensive map of corruption within the military supply chain. "We think Thor may have been exposed to evidence of a massive conspiracy during your deployment," Dr. Morrison continued. "A conspiracy involving stolen supplies, diverted funds, and compromised personnel at the highest levels of military command. That's why we were transferred back to the States so quickly," Marcus realized. "Someone wanted us out of Afghanistan before Thor could identify more of the people involved. And now, with Colonel Whitfield's court-martial, they're faced with a dilemma. They need to know if Thor still remembers the scents and chemical signatures of the other conspirators. They need to know if he can still identify them." Marcus looked down at his partner, at the loyal animal who had saved countless lives, and was now carrying secrets that could bring down generals, politicians, and defense contractors. "That's why they suggested I attend the trial. They want to see if Thor recognizes anyone else. But they made a critical error in judgment," Dr. Morrison said with a grim smile. "They assumed Thor's abilities had diminished with age and civilian life. They thought he was just a retired military dog playing with veterans in a hospital. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and now Thor is using what may be the last hours of his life to expose them all. Present day. Courthouse, emergency. Medical room Dr. Chen worked frantically over Thor's still form in the small medical room adjacent to the courtroom. Marcus knelt beside the table, his hand maintaining constant contact with his partner, while Victoria Lawson paced behind them, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, sir, I understand the implications," Lawson said into the phone. "But we have a witness who's just admitted to being coerced, and we have what amounts to a detection dog, identifying multiple suspects in a conspiracy that goes far beyond Colonel Whitfield." "Yes, sir, I know how it sounds." Hassan sat in the corner, his hands shaking as he clutched a cup of coffee. The revelation that he had been threatened into modifying his testimony had opened a floodgate of information that was rewriting the entire case. "Marcus," Hassan said quietly, "there's something else I didn't tell you. When the men came to my house, they had photographs." "Photographs of what?" "Of you and Thor. Recent photographs taken here in America. Pictures of you at the VA hospital. Pictures of Thor working with patients. Pictures of your apartment, your daily routine. They knew everything about your life." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "They've been watching us. For months, maybe longer. And they had detailed files on Thor's abilities. They knew about his work at Walter Reed, about Dr. Morrison's research, about the other dogs who have died." Victoria Lawson ended her phone call and turned to face the group. "I just spoke with the Attorney General's office. They're sending a joint FBI-DOD task force to take over this investigation. What we're looking at isn't just embezzlement, it's a conspiracy that involves at least 3 generals, 2 State Department officials, and an unknown number of defense contractors." "How long have they known?" Marcus asked. "The investigation started 18 months ago when Brigadier General Thompson died in what was ruled a heart attack. Thompson had been asking questions about supply chain irregularities in Afghanistan, and his K9 partner, Ranger, had been demonstrating the same enhanced detection abilities as Thor." Dr. Chen looked up from her monitoring equipment. "Thor's vitals are stabilizing, but barely. It's as if he's holding on through sheer force of will." Marcus knew that was exactly what was happening. Thor had always been a dog with a mission. Whether it was finding explosives, rescuing trapped children, or comforting wounded veterans. Now his mission was justice, and he wouldn't let go until it was complete. "Hassan," Marcus said, "I need you to tell me about every person Thor reacted to during our deployment, every civilian contractor, every visiting official, every Afghan national who made him nervous. That could take hours, and some of the names, Marcus, some of these people are very powerful." "Then we better get started," Victoria Lawson said grimly, "because in about 20 minutes Judge Morrison is going to reconvene court, and we need to be ready to present evidence of the biggest military corruption scandal since Watergate." Hassan took a deep breath and began to speak, his words painting a picture of systematic theft, betrayal and cover-up that stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the halls of power in Washington. As he talked, Thor's breathing seemed to strengthen, as if the dog understood that the truth was finally being told. But outside in the courthouse corridor, 3 men in expensive suits were making phone calls of their own, and their conversations carried a tone of desperate urgency that would have made Thor's fur stand on end. The conspiracy was fighting back. Present day, Courtroom 3B, 2:47 p.m. Judge Morrison gavelled the court back into session, but the atmosphere in Courtroom 3B had transformed completely. What had begun as a routine court-martial now resembled a war zone with FBI agents stationed at every entrance, DoD investigators conferring in hushed tones, and a palpable sense that something monumental was about to unfold. Thor lay on a specially constructed platform beside the witness stand, Dr. Chen monitoring his condition while Marcus knelt protectively beside him. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, his amber eyes alert and focused on the proceedings with an intensity that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Morrison announced, "based on new evidence that has come to light during today's proceedings, this court-martial is being expanded to include additional charges and additional defendants. Prosecutor Lawson, you may proceed." Victoria Lawson rose, her demeanor transformed from courtroom professional to crusading attorney. In her hand, she held a thick folder that had been delivered by FBI courier just minutes earlier. "Your Honor, the government moves to amend the charges against Colonel Whitfield to include conspiracy to commit treason, conspiracy to defraud the United States government in excess of $50 million, and conspiracy to obstruct justice through intimidation of witnesses." A murmur ran through the gallery. Colonel Whitfield's face had gone ashen, but it was the reaction of 3 men in the back rows that caught everyone's attention. 3 men who suddenly seemed very interested in their phones and very eager to leave. "Furthermore," Lawson continued, "the government moves to issue arrest warrants for Robert Patterson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, General Raymond Hayes, currently assigned to the Pentagon, and Hassan al-Rashid, defense contractor currently believed to be in the Washington, D.C. area." The courtroom erupted. Defense Attorney Garrett leapt to his feet, his composure shattered. "Your Honor, this is a complete ambush. We've had no notice of these additional charges, no opportunity to prepare." "Sit down, Counselor," Judge Morrison commanded. "These proceedings are now classified under national security provisions. Bailiff Rodriguez, seal the courtroom. No one enters or leaves without my express permission." As Rodriguez moved to secure the doors, one of the 3 men in the back row, a silver-haired man with a scar on his left hand, rose and began walking toward the exit. But as he passed Thor's position near the witness stand, the impossible happened. Thor, despite his critical condition, despite the medical equipment monitoring his every heartbeat, somehow found the strength to raise his head and release one of those otherworldly vocalizations that had already become legendary in the courthouse. But this sound was different, sharper, more urgent, filled with a recognition that transcended ordinary animal behavior. The silver-haired man froze as if he had been struck by lightning. "General Hayes," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a rifle shot. "I think Thor remembers you." The man everyone now knew was General Raymond Hayes turned slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Sergeant. I'm here as an observer, nothing more." But Thor's reaction told a different story. The dog struggled to his feet, his legs shaking with effort, and performed the same alert position he had maintained for Colonel Whitfield earlier. His nose was working overtime, his body language screaming detection, recognition, guilt. "Interesting," Dr. Chen observed, checking her monitoring equipment. "Thor's stress indicators are off the charts, but not in a distressed way. This is the physiological signature of a detection dog who has found exactly what he was looking for." Victoria Lawson consulted her file, then looked directly at General Hayes. "General, according to military transport logs, you made 17 visits to Forward Operating Base Shank during the time period in question. You met regularly with Colonel Whitfield. You had access to supply manifests and transport schedules, and you signed off on multiple equipment requisitions that were never fulfilled." Those meetings were classified operational briefings, Hayes replied, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the courtroom's controlled temperature. Were they also classified when you met with Robert Patterson and Hassan al-Rashid to coordinate the diversion of reconstruction funds to private accounts? The question hit like a bombshell. Hassan, who had been silent in the witness gallery, suddenly stood up, his face pale but resolute. "I can't do this anymore," Hassan announced, his voice shaking but clear. "General Hayes, you promised my family would be safe if I kept quiet. You promised the threats would stop if I modified my testimony. But looking at Thor, seeing what this dog is willing to die for, I cannot live with these lies anymore." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Hassan, are you indicating that you wish to revise your previous testimony?" "Yes, Your Honor. Everything I said about Colonel Whitfield stealing money was true, but I did not tell you about the others. I did not tell you about the meetings in General Hayes's quarters, about the private helicopters bringing American civilians to the base, about the supply trucks that left full and returned empty." General Hayes's military composure finally cracked. "Hassan, I'm warning you." "You're warning him." Marcus rose from beside Thor, his voice filled with the righteous anger of a soldier who had seen too much betrayal. "General, you sent us into combat zones based on intelligence you knew was compromised. You put American lives at risk to protect your stolen money. Sergeant Rivera, you will stand down." Hayes barked, his voice carrying the automatic authority of decades of command. But Thor had other ideas. The dying dog somehow summoned the strength to walk directly to General Hayes, to sit in perfect alert position at the general's feet, and to maintain unwavering eye contact in a way that conveyed more accusation than any human testimony could achieve. "Jesus Christ," Bailiff Rodriguez whispered. "That dog is staring right through him." And indeed, something seemed to be happening to General Hayes under Thor's gaze. The confident military bearing began to crumble, the authoritative presence wavered, and for the first time since the proceedings began, everyone in the courtroom saw him for what he really was, a guilty man confronted by the one witness he had never thought to fear. "You want to know the truth?" Hayes suddenly exploded, his voice cracking with years of suppressed guilt and rage. "You want to know what that damn dog knows? Fine. Yes, we diverted the funds. Yes, we sold equipment on the black market. Yes, we let Afghan children go without medical supplies while we lined our pockets." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Colonel Whitfield buried his face in his hands. Hassan began to weep openly. But General Hayes wasn't finished. "But we weren't. Monsters," he continued, his voice growing more desperate. "We were patriots trying to fund off-the-books operations that Congress wouldn't authorize. We were protecting American interests in a region where traditional diplomacy had failed." "By stealing from Afghan orphanages?" Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet. "By doing what needed to be done," Hayes shot back. "By making the hard choices that generals have to make when politicians and bureaucrats tie their hands with rules and regulations." Thor released another of his supernatural vocalizations, and this time the sound carried a quality that made everyone present understand they were hearing the voice of justice itself, patient, implacable, and utterly unforgiving. "The dog knows," Hayes whispered, his bravado finally collapsing entirely. "Somehow that damn dog knows everything. Every meeting, every payoff, every life we put at risk to protect our operation." Victoria Lawson stepped forward, her voice cutting through the emotional chaos like a blade. "General Hayes, are you confessing to conspiracy to commit treason against the United States of America?" Hayes looked around the courtroom, at the shocked faces of soldiers and civilians alike, at the FBI agents moving to strategic positions, at the loyal animal who had spent his life serving truth and was now using his dying breath to ensure justice prevailed. "I'm confessing to being a soldier who made impossible choices in an impossible war," he said finally. "And I'm confessing that your dog is a better judge of character than any of us ever gave him credit for." As FBI agents moved to place General Hayes under arrest, Thor slowly, deliberately lay back down on his platform. His job was done. The truth had been exposed. Justice would be served, but the cost of that service was becoming apparent to everyone. In the courtroom, as Dr. Chen checked her monitors and shook her head gravely, Thor was dying, and he had used the last of his strength to ensure that the guilty would not escape unpunished. Present day. Courthouse steps, 4:15 p.m. The news had spread through Washington like wildfire. By the time the emergency session concluded, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters, military personnel, veterans advocates, and curious civilians who had heard rumors of something extraordinary happening in Courtroom 3B. Inside, Thor lay unconscious on his platform, his breathing so shallow that Dr. Chen had to check for vital signs every few minutes. Marcus had not left his partner's side, his hand maintaining constant contact with the familiar scar behind Thor's ear. Sergeant Rivera, Judge Morrison approached quietly, her formal judicial demeanor softened by obvious emotion. I wanted you to know that what Thor did today, it's going to change everything. The investigation he made possible will expose corruption that reaches into the highest levels of government. Marcus looked up from his vigil. Judge, I need you to know that Thor didn't do this for glory or recognition. He did it because he spent his entire life serving truth, and he couldn't bear to see justice denied. I understand, she replied, and I want you to know that what happened here today will be remembered. There are already calls for a congressional investigation, for reforms in military contracting, for accountability measures that should have been in place years ago. Through the courtroom's tall windows, they could see the gathering crowd outside. News vans from every major network, protesters carrying signs demanding justice for veterans, Afghan nationals who had heard about Hassan's testimony and come to show support, FBI agent Sarah Martinez, who had been coordinating the expanded investigation, approached with an update. Sergeant Rivera, I thought you should know. We've arrested Robert Patterson at Dulles Airport trying to board a flight to Dubai. Hassan al-Rashid was taken into custody at a hotel in Arlington. Both of them are cooperating fully, providing details about bank accounts, shell companies, and other co-conspirators. How big is this thing? Marcus asked. Bigger than we initially thought. The DoD Inspector General estimates that over $200 million in Afghan reconstruction funds were diverted over a 4-year period. That money was meant for schools, hospitals, infrastructure projects that could have saved thousands of lives. Dr. Chen looked up from her monitors. Thor's heart rate is becoming irregular. I don't think he has much time left. As if responding to her words, Thor's eyes fluttered open. Those amber eyes that had seen so much, saved so many lives, and today had served justice one final time, focused on Marcus with an expression of profound peace. Hey boy, Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. You did it. You got them all. Through the courtroom doors they could hear the crowd outside beginning to chant something. The words were unclear at first, but gradually became distinct. Thank you, Thor. Thank you, Thor. Hassan approached the platform, tears streaming down his face. Marcus, may I say something to him? Marcus nodded, understanding that Hassan needed to make his own peace with the dog who had forced him to choose truth over fear. Hassan knelt beside the platform and spoke in gentle Pashto, his words carrying the weight of gratitude, apology, and respect. When he finished, he looked at Marcus with eyes full of tears. I told him that Allah sent him as a guardian angel, just like that little girl said years ago. I told him that he saved not just lives, but souls. I told him that his courage gave me the strength to tell the truth. Outside, the crowd had grown, larger and more vocal. Veterans in wheelchairs, family members of fallen soldiers, Afghan Americans who had heard about the case, all of them drawn by the incredible story of a dying dog who had exposed corruption and demanded justice. Sergeant Rivera, a young reporter called through the window, can you tell us about Thor's condition? Marcus looked at the gathering crowd, at the faces filled with hope and grief and admiration for an animal who had given everything in service to others. He made a decision that would define how Thor's story would be remembered. Open the doors, he told Bailiff Rodriguez. Let them see him. Marcus, are you sure? Dr. Chen asked. The stress of that many people, Thor has never hidden from his duty, Marcus replied. He's not going to start now. As the courthouse doors opened, A respectful silence fell over the crowd. People filed in slowly, quietly, as if entering a cathedral. Veterans saluted as they passed Thor's platform. Children reached out to gently touch his fur. Afghan Americans whispered prayers in their native language. An elderly woman in a military widow's pin approached Marcus. "My husband died in Afghanistan," she said quietly. "He always said the dogs were the real heroes over there. Thank you for letting us honor Thor." A teenage girl with her father, both wearing military uniforms, stopped beside the platform. "Sir," the girl said to Marcus, "my dad says Thor is the kind of soldier he hopes to be someday, loyal, brave, and true." One by one, people came to pay their respects to the dying K9 who had served with distinction, saved countless lives, and used his final hours to ensure that justice prevailed. The courtroom filled with quiet conversations, shared stories, and an overwhelming sense that they were witnessing something historic. "Marcus," Dr. Chen whispered urgently. "His heart rate is dropping rapidly. I think this is it." Marcus leaned close to Thor's ear, his voice barely audible over the quiet murmur of the crowd. "Thank you, partner. Thank you for everything. For saving my life. For saving all those lives. For never giving up on the truth. You're the best soldier I've ever known." Thor's eyes opened one last time, not focusing on Marcus or the crowd or the courtroom, but looking towards something beyond, something that only he could see. His tail moved slightly, a tiny wag that somehow conveyed peace, satisfaction, and readiness for whatever came next. And then, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his service, Thor took his final breath. The silence that followed was profound, respectful, and filled with the kind of grief reserved for genuine heroes. But it was also filled with something else, a sense that Thor's death was not an ending, but a transformation. His legacy would live on in the reforms his sacrifice would inspire, in the accountability his courage had demanded, and in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed his final act of service. 1 week later, Arlington National Cemetery. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Arlington National Cemetery as an unprecedented gathering took place near the tomb of the unknown soldier. Officially, Thor was being buried in the military working dog section of the cemetery, but the crowd that had assembled suggested this was something far more significant than a routine military funeral. Marcus stood at attention in his dress uniform, his chest adorned with the medals he had earned alongside Thor in Afghanistan. Beside him, an honor guard of K9 handlers and their partners maintained perfect formation, each dog sitting in respectful silence as if they understood the gravity of the moment. General Patricia Williams, the new head of the military's K9 program, stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. "We gather today not just to honor Thor, a German shepherd who served with distinction in Afghanistan, but to recognize a truth that Thor himself revealed in his final hours, that loyalty, courage, and dedication to justice are not uniquely human virtues." The crowd included hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Thor's service. Veterans he had comforted at Walter Reed, soldiers whose lives he had saved in Afghanistan, family members of fallen servicemen who saw in Thor's story a reflection of their own loved one's sacrifice. Hassan stood with his family, his wife and children having been safely brought to America under a special protection program. Beside them, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison held a thick folder containing her research on enhanced detection abilities in military working dogs. Research that would now be used to protect rather than exploit these remarkable animals. Judge Morrison sat in the front row, still processing the legal and ethical implications of the week that had changed her understanding of justice itself. The Thor case, as it was already being called, would be studied in law schools for decades to come. Thor's final act of service, General Williams continued, exposed a conspiracy that robbed resources from those who needed them most: Afghan children, wounded veterans, military families struggling with the aftermath of war. But more than that, he showed us that truth has its own defenders, that justice finds its own advocates, even in the most unlikely forms. Victoria Lawson, who had spent the week coordinating with federal prosecutors as the conspiracy investigation expanded, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. The evidence Thor had helped expose would lead to dozens of additional arrests, the recovery of hundreds of millions of dollars, and reforms that would prevent similar corruption in the future. As the ceremony continued, a young Afghan-American girl named Amara, the same child Thor had saved from the collapsed building years earlier, approached the casket with her adoptive American family. She placed a small American flag beside the larger one that draped Thor's coffin and whispered something in Pashto that her translator mother repeated in English. She says Thor was her guardian angel, and now he's going to be everyone's guardian. Angel! The military honor guard performed the flag-folding ceremony with precision that spoke of years of practice and profound respect. But when they presented the flag to Marcus, even these hardened veterans had tears in their eyes. "On behalf of a grateful nation," the lead guard said, "we present this flag in recognition of Thor's faithful and honorable service to the United States of America." Marcus accepted the flag, his composure finally breaking as he clutched the symbol of everything Thor had fought and died for. Around him, the sound of sniffling and quiet sobs indicated that he was not alone in his grief. Dr. Chen, who had stayed with Thor until the end, approached with something wrapped in a soft cloth. "Marcus, I thought you should have this," she said, unwrapping Thor's collar. The same collar he had worn through 2 deployments, 3 years of therapy work, and his final day of service in the courthouse. Attached to the collar was Thor's service medal, but also something new, a small wooden carving of a German shepherd that Hassan had made during the week following Thor's death. "It's from Afghan olive wood," Hassan explained. "In my culture, we believe that when a guardian spirit passes on, we should carry something to remember their protection." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus remained beside the grave, the folded flag clutched against his chest, Thor's collar in his other hand. The morning mist was lifting, revealing the Washington Monument in the distance and the Capitol Dome beyond that, symbols of the democracy that Thor had served so faithfully. "You know," said a voice behind him, "he's still protecting people." Marcus turned to find General Williams approaching, her formal demeanor softened by obvious emotion. "How do you mean, ma'am?" "The reforms we're implementing because of what Thor exposed. Enhanced screening for military contractors, new oversight for reconstruction funds, protection programs for whistleblowers. They're all being called the Thor protocols." Marcus smiled. Through his tears. He'd like that. He always was about the mission, never about the recognition. "There's something else," General Williams continued. "Congress is fast-tracking legislation to establish a new program for military working dogs with enhanced detection capabilities. It's going to be called the Thor Initiative, and it's going to ensure that these remarkable animals are protected, studied, and honored appropriately. And the other dogs like Thor, the ones who developed these abilities after trauma, they'll be safe. No more mysterious accidents, no more unexplained deaths. We're going to make sure Thor's sacrifice means something." As Marcus prepared to leave, he noticed something that made his heart skip. A young German shepherd puppy, barely 3 months old, had wandered away from his handler and was sitting quietly beside Thor's grave, his posture eerily reminiscent of Thor's own alert position. "Who's the pup?" Marcus asked. The handler, a young corporal named Davis, approached with a mixture of embarrassment and wonder. "This is Zeus, sir. He's part of our new K9 training program. I have no idea how he got away from me, but he's been sitting there for the past 10 minutes, perfectly." "Still?" Marcus knelt beside the puppy, who looked up at him with intelligent brown eyes that seemed somehow familiar. As Marcus reached out to pet him, Zeus did something that made everyone present stop and stare. He placed his small paw directly on the spot where Marcus's hand rested on Thor's grave, as if creating a connection between past and future, between the dog who had served and the dog who would someday serve, I think, Marcus said quietly. "Thor just introduced us to his replacement." 6 months later, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Marcus sat in the same waiting room where Dr. Morrison had first explained Thor's extraordinary abilities, but this time he wasn't alone. Zeus, now 9 months old and showing remarkable aptitude for both explosive detection and the enhanced emotional sensing that had made Thor legendary, lay beside his chair with the calm confidence of a dog born to serve. The wall opposite them now featured a bronze plaque with Thor's image and a simple inscription that had been suggested by Hassan and approved by everyone who had witnessed Thor's final day of service. In memory of Thor, military working dog who proved that loyalty knows no species, courage knows no bounds, and truth needs no voice to be heard. His service lives on in every life he saved, every injustice he exposed, and every heart he touched. Greater love has no dog than this, that he would lay down his life for justice. Below the plaque, in smaller text, were the words that had become the unofficial motto of the Thor Initiative. He never barked again after that final day. Not because he couldn't, but because he had already spoken the truth that mattered most. As Marcus prepared to begin Zeus's first therapy session with wounded veterans, he noticed the young dog looking intently at Thor's memorial, his posture perfect, his attention focused, as if receiving final instructions from a master he had never met but somehow understood. "Ready to work, partner?" Marcus asked quietly. Zeus looked up at him with eyes that held the same intelligence, the same dedication, the same unwavering commitment to truth that had defined his predecessor. Then, with a dignity that seemed far beyond his months, he rose and walked toward the therapy wing, where wounded warriors waited for the healing that only a dog's unconditional love could provide. Behind them, sunlight streaming through the hospital windows illuminated Thor's memorial, and for just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw the reflection of amber eyes in the bronze plaque, watchful, protective, and eternally vigilant in the service of those who needed defending most. The truth had found its voice, justice had found its guardian, and somewhere beyond the reach of human understanding, a loyal German shepherd continued his eternal watch, ensuring that courage would never be forgotten and betrayal would never go unpunished. Thor's last salute had not been an ending, it had been a promise. This story is dedicated to all military working dogs who have served alongside our armed forces and to the handlers who love them. While Thor's story is fiction, the courage, loyalty, and sacrifice it represents are very real. May we never forget those who serve without voice but with unlimited heart.